Great. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's great to see all of you. This is a webinar titled Community Benefits Agreements, a legal tool to promote equitable development and empower disenfranchised residents. My name is Joe Jampel. I'm a staff attorney at Regional Housing Legal Services. Presenting along with me today, I have my colleague, Bob Damewood. He's also an attorney at RHLS. Bob's based in our Pittsburgh office. I'm based in Philadelphia. And also we have Kim Washington, who's the executive director of Frankfurt CDC in lower Northeast Philadelphia. Kim is an attorney, but today, for the sake of this discussion, Kim's wearing her nonprofit leader hat. So before we jump into the content, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to Regional Housing Legal Services for those who may not be familiar with it. We are a plan program. We're one of the specialty statewide programs. And I think that the vast majority of the work that we do really falls into one of two areas. So the first area is providing transactional legal services to nonprofit organizations that are developing affordable housing. And then the other area is engaging in policy work that promotes the production, preservation, and equity of affordable housing. And the work that we're talking about today, our CBA work, actually doesn't neatly fall into either of these buckets, but it does really draw on our expertise in transactional real estate and affordable housing law. Overall, what I think makes RHLS the work that we do really unique and impactful is that we combine our expertise in transactional affordable housing law with the flexibility and creativity of a nonprofit to craft legal solutions that address affordable housing issues. So with that, I just wanted to provide an outline of the presentation today. To start, I'm going to offer a definition of community benefits agreements. After that, Bob and Kim are going to present on CBAs that they have worked on and been involved with. And that's going to provide a nice background for our discussion and will help, for those who aren't as familiar with CBAs, help make things more concrete in terms of what a CBA is. After Bob and Kim have presented, Bob, Kim, and I are going to have a discussion about some of the issues and questions around CBAs. And after that, we will have an opportunity for Q&A. So what is a community benefits agreement? The definition I'm presenting here has three elements. The first element is that it's a contract between community representatives and a developer of a real estate project. And in the case of RHLS, our clients are generally going to be the community representatives. And in most cases, that will be a nonprofit such as Frankfurt CDC. The second part of the definition is a CBA will outline how a development will provide benefits desired by the community. So in a CBA, a developer is going to promise to provide benefits to the community, and these can really be anything that the community wants and that the developer is willing to provide. So common benefits we see are affordable housing, local hiring, space for community use, space for local businesses, etc. And then the third element of the definition is that a CBA will ensure that community representatives will support or at least remain neutral on the project. So in general, the reason why a developer will agree to enter into the CBA is because they want community support, and they want that community support because that's important in order to obtain some sort of government action, like a zoning variance, like getting public land, like getting public subsidies. And so a CBA will generally have a term where the community is committing to provide that support. So that is sort of a broad and theoretical definition. So now I'm going to turn this over to Bob so that he can talk about CBAs in Pittsburgh's Hill District. And Bob, you should just tell me when you want me to switch slides.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So, like Joe said, I'm Bob Damewood, staff attorney in the Pittsburgh Office of Regional Housing Legal Services, and I'm going to talk about two CBA efforts in Pittsburgh's Hill District. So, for folks who aren't familiar with Pittsburgh, the Hill District is a predominantly Black neighborhood adjacent to downtown. It's chronically disinvested, but culturally extremely rich. So, folks know, the works of August Wilson, Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. 9 of his of the 10 plays in his Century cycle were set in the Hill District. He grew up in the Hill District and wrote about it. The Hill, residents of the Hill have tend to have very low incomes, extremely low incomes, low rates of home ownership, poor quality housing, all of which makes them vulnerable to displacement. But at the same time, because of, I don't know if it's because of the cultural richness, but I'm sure that plays into it. There's a very committed cadre of residents and organizations in the Hill District that are just dedicated to preserving and improving the Hill. And next slide, please. So the two, that slide, thanks. So the two CBAs both, that I'm going to talk about, both concern the Lower Hill District. The Lower Hill was long the cultural and commercial heart of the Hill District. Harlem Renaissance poet Claude McKay famously called an intersection in the Lower Hill the crossroads of the world because of its thriving jazz scene at the time. So that, keep that in mind when, so I think the cultural impact of the Lower Hill is, it still resonates in the neighborhood. And so ensuring that the Lower Hill District is redeveloped as part of the neighborhood and not just part of downtown, not just an extension of downtown, is vitally important to the residents in the Hill. But anyway, so the Lower Hill, the part that you can see that giant spaceship looking thing surrounded by a sea of parking, and then the buildings to the left of that, used to be businesses and residences, and it was taken through urban renewal in the 50s and 60s, and developed into a civic light opera, and like you can see a sea of parking. The Civic Light Opera later became a hockey arena for the Pittsburgh Penguins. In 2006, the Penguins threatened to leave town unless they got a lot of money for a new arena. And the mayor and governor obliged and gave massive subsidies for a $200 million arena, plus gave them development rights to the Lower Hill District. In 2008, the arena CBA was signed. And the new arena is where those buildings are to the left of the giant spaceship looking thing in the photo. And there was a CBA around that development in particular. And then later, 2014, there was another CBA called the Community Collaboration and Implementation Plan, or CCIP, that was signed with respect to the remaining 28 acres. So that sea of parking and the spaceship looking thing that have since been demolished. Next slide. So I was on the negotiating team for the Arena CBA. Marimba, who unfortunately couldn't present today, led the community stakeholders on the CSIP. There were two very different approaches that we'll get into in more detail later. But essentially, the Arena CBA was a grassroots neighborhood coalition with union and environmental partners from outside the neighborhood. The CSIP was a team of professionals assembled by the city councilmen. A team of professionals from the neighborhoods, people with experience in real estate development, community development, workforce development, et cetera, from the neighborhood, kind of the best from the neighborhood, assembled by the city councilmen. Both CBAs were successful at getting commitments of money for the neighborhood. The CSIP did a much better job at establishing a framework for ongoing collaboration and implementation after the agreement was signed. The Arena development and the Arena CBA have both been completed, and the Lower Hill development and the CSIP as of now are just getting started. And with that, that's the background for the Lower Hill. And with that, I will pass it to Kimberly.
Great. And before Kim gets started, I just want to make one point to put this stuff into context. Something that's helpful with Bob and Kim being here and talking about these different CBAs is that you're going to be able to see how different in scope and size CBAs can be. So these ones that Bob is talking about, I think these CBAs are on the sort of larger end in terms of covering a huge development that's tens of millions of dollars and involving a huge array of stakeholders, whereas what Kim's going to talk about is a CBA sort of on a more on a smaller scale. So Kim, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. I was actually going to open up with that very statement. I think what you guys accomplished in the Hill District was awesome, and on a much larger scale than what we worked on here in Frankfurt. So just to back up a little bit, as Joe said, I'm Kim Washington. I'm the executive director for the Frankfurt CDC, lifelong resident of Frankfurt. Grew up here in the neighborhood, went off to college and law school, and somehow ended up back in Frankfurt after my law school, starting my career doing community engagement here. So this work is like very close and near and dear to my heart. Just for folks who may not be familiar with Frankfurt, we are in the lower northeast section of the city of Philadelphia. And so if you are familiar with the mass transit line, we so proudly told that fact that we are the first 3 stops on the Frankfurt L. So one of the second busiest stations is the Frankfurt Transportation Center. And our neighborhood runs from that station all the way down to the Church Street station. And our west and eastern boundaries consist of Roosevelt Boulevard and the Amtrak Railroad line along Aramingo Avenue. So you can go to the next slide, Joe. I'll just talk a little bit about our demographics for the neighborhood. Just in terms of who we are as a neighborhood, it's also a very industrially rich neighborhood. Traditionally, Frankfurt is split up between East Frankfurt and Northwood. And the way those neighborhoods are split up is Northwood is sort of to the west side of Frankfurt Avenue, which is our main commercial corridor, and East Frankfurt is, of course, to the east of Frankfurt Avenue. And what really split the neighborhoods historically was Frankfurt Hospital. And so, like I said, we're an industrially rich neighborhood, or we were. And so all of the factory owners and the doctors from Frankfurt Hospital traditionally lived on the Northwood side, which you'll see like our huge mansion style houses, and sort of the warehouse workers lived on the east side of Frankfurt. So those are the smaller row home type of folks, which was really sort of like a class separation as well. So the wealthier folks lived on the west side, and the low to moderate income folks lived on the east side. And actually the neighborhood is traditional. It's still kind of split in that manner. where you have wealthier homeowners living on the west side, and sort of more of a concentration of the low to moderate income folks living on the east side of the neighborhood. But so, like I said, we're in the lower northeast section of the city. Our transportation center is the second busiest transportation hub in the city of Philadelphia. And if you followed development in the city of Philadelphia, you would notice that gentrification has really been taking off, and it's been traveling east of the city from, I would say, from South Philly up through Northern Liberties, Port Richmond, and Bridesburg, and now Kensington, which all neighborhoods that are a few L stops to the south of us. And so Frankfurt is the next neighborhood up from the Fishtown and Kensington neighborhoods. And so given the rate at which gentrification has been displacing folks to the south of us, we, I think on a regular basis are talking to neighborhood residents and funders and city officials about how we sort of sustain some of the housing and job opportunities to sort of balance out development for some of the folks who have been here for a really long time. Which is really challenging because, as the slides show, about a third of our residents are living below the poverty line. So next slide, Joe. So the property that we're talking about today is 4914 Penn Street. This is actually historically served as the nursing school for Frankfurt Hospital. So it sits one block behind Frankfurt Hospital, which I told you again was a real dividing line between income class for folks in Frankfurt. And so we knew in negotiating this project that we wanted to, well, the proposed project is to renovate the old nursing school building to turn it into apartments, but above market rate apartment units. So right off the bat, we knew going into this that we would be negotiating for affordable housing units. It's a big construction project on scale. So we wanted to make sure that we negotiated for local contracting for and local hiring when it came to permanent jobs for this project. The building is also what we consider a historical gem in Frankfurt in terms of the facade, but also inside there's a lot of stained glass. There's a really beautiful marble staircase inside. And so we also wanted to negotiate for some preservation in terms of the building's facade for this project. So those were just some of the things that we negotiated in our community benefits agreement.
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt. This is Kelly. I just need to launch the first of the attorney CLE polls. You should see it pop up on your screen now. I will leave this up for 2 minutes. Attorneys must respond to both poll questions in order to receive CLE credit. And Kim, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Please feel free to continue.
No, that's okay. And so I think I was just coming up on the end. I think that might be my last slide. Joe, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
But I think that pretty much sums up our community benefits agreement.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bob and Kim. I think those examples are really helpful for putting some meat on the bones of understanding what a CBA is. And so now what we're going to do is I'm going to pose some questions to Bob and Kim to get a little deeper into the issues around CBAs. And I'm going to give Bob and Kim will answer them, and then I will probably also be jumping in from time to time to offer my own perspective. So the first question I wanted to ask Bob and Kim was to talk a little bit about how a CBA movement or negotiation actually gets started. What sort of leads a CBA process to begin? And either Bob or Kim, you can field that first.
I'll jump in. I'll start since I'm already off of mute. So our CBA process started as sort of our the zoning process. So as the community development organization in Frankfurt, we also are the facilitators of the community zoning process. So in Philadelphia, we're actually called a registered community organization. We're registered with the City Planning Commission, and what that looks like is when developers want to make changes to a building and those changes require some type of variance from the city's zoning board of adjustments, they go through a process where they get a refusal from the city, and then the city sends them back to community residents to present their project and to get community approval for their project. Throughout that process, when the developers came to us for this project, that kind of gave us our leverage to start negotiating what residents wanted to see out of this project in exchange for our community support, which we would then send to the ZBA for the developer to be able to get ZBA approval. So I think that pretty much summed up how our process got started.
How things got started in the Hill was a product of, community outrage. So, I mean, it started with kind of a backroom deal between the Penguins and the mayor and the governor that gave the Penguins everything they wanted, right? Which meant there wasn't a whole lot of community leverage over the Penguins, but there was, public officials can be held responsible. And so, the Arena CBA having a broad coalition of not only community residents and activists from the community, from the neighborhood, but also, faith-based and labor and environmental organizations, throughout the city, it really helped put some political pressure on public officials. And so, I mean, that's kind of how the Arena CBA, I mean, just the outrage that a deal was cut concerning, an important part of the neighborhood without engaging anybody in the neighborhood first, created such outrage that people came together to try to influence that process. And then in the CSIP, that was kind of a continuation of that. But like I said, a city council representative, convened neighborhood stakeholders to sit down with the Penguins and with other public officials and work out an implementation plan for the remainder of the development.
Thanks, and it's interesting to note sort of the contrast there. I think the situation I've seen. The situation Kim described is more typically what I see in terms of the CBA process gets kicked off when a developer approaches the community because they have some sort of need, and that sort of kicks it off. But as Bob's experience shows, sometimes it really depends on the community organizing and really making their voices heard to force the conversation. So sometimes the conversation sort of arises that it's sort of developer initiated, and sometimes it's more community initiated.
Can I make one clarifying?
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry for not mentioning this. So in the CSIP, it covers a 28-acre, multi-phase, multi-year development project, and there will always be changes and there will always be public approvals necessary, right? So there was more ongoing, leverage, concerning that than there was concerning the Arena CBA. So I don't want to say that there was no leverage and that the developer didn't need the community at all. I think they needed the community a lot more for the CSIP, for the Lower Hill development than they did for the Arena.
Interesting. Thanks, Bob. A point I wanted to make from sort of the attorney perspective about this sort of stage of the process, the sort of early stages, is that I think in my experience, it's best, especially during the early stages of a CBA, for the lawyers to be in the in the background as much as possible, and for the community and the developer to be in the foreground. And I think that's true for a couple different reasons. One reason is that, in my opinion, the community is always going to be able to better speak to what they need and what they want, both in terms of substance and in terms of like expressing why, better than their lawyer is. And I also think that through the community process of determining what they want and negotiating that, I think that's an opportunity for the community itself to build capacity and to really understand what's going into the CBA, and that's going to be helpful once the CBA is signed, and the community still needs to be paying attention to make sure that it's being monitored and implemented. And so every situation is different, and we get brought into CBA negotiations at many different stages. But if we're contacted, or I should say, if I'm contacted and it's very early on in the stages, I generally encourage the community representative I'm talking to focus on working out a term sheet with the developer where they will negotiate between themselves to reach agreement on like the major terms that will be on the CBA. And so then hopefully the role of the attorneys will be to come in later and document things to make sure that all those benefits that were agreed upon are as legally binding as possible. And of course, like things are never quite that simple. I even during that stage, I do like to be talking with the client to make sure that the terms they're talking about make sense, and I like to compare them to things that other clients have gotten them to agree to. But in general, I don't like to sort of come to the foreground until later on. So the next question I have for Kim and Bob is about, we heard, from you, Bob, about the Arena CBA and the CSIP. It sounded like there were a lot of different stakeholders involved and a lot of different people representing the community at the table. For Frankfurt CDC, it was really Frankfurt CDC at the front. I'm curious how it's determined who's going to participate in the CBA process. And either Kim or Bob can take that first.
Right. So for our organization, it was our members of our actual registered community organization who are also residents of Frankfurt. So they facilitate the zoning process. And then our nonprofit, who is actually, we help coordinate with the community residents through the city channels. So we have some leverage as a nonprofit organization in terms of our working relationship with the different city departments. And then, of course, the actual registered community organization board, which are all residents of Frankfurt. And so it made sense that we jointly kind of negotiated that agreement. And so you would have the force of both the nonprofit entity representing the neighborhood, but also, proof that this is, a stakeholder-led conversation, and not just like Kim Washington going in and saying, this is what we need and this is what we want, but actual residents who kind of lead this process. So, both our entity and the zoning committee were, like I said, they live here. And we're both very familiar with what the needs are. We participate jointly in our neighborhood planning efforts. And so we're kind of on the same page, not always about everything, but for most things, we're on the same page about, what we need to go in negotiating for our residents.
And so, Bob, I'll just cut in for 1 second. So, if you were to look at the CBA that Frankfurt CDC signed, you would just see on behalf of the community, one signatory, Frankfurt CDC, Kim Washington signing on behalf. But I think what we heard from Kim there is that and Kim, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that in Frankfurt CDC and the RCO are recognized as being representative of the community, and a lot of work has been done, intentional work, to make sure that that's the case, so that when Frankfurt CDC is negotiating a CBA, it's recognized that that is the voice of the community coming through. It's not just one nonprofit that happens to be located in a neighborhood that's saying they speak for the neighborhood when in fact maybe they don't.
Right. And I think that comes at different levels for our organization. I think first and foremost, we are a HUD certified community-based organization, which means that 51% of our board is made up of folks who either live, work, or represent nonprofit organizations in the neighborhood. So it starts at our board level. Our staffing reflects folks who live in the neighborhood, and even down to our advisory committee. So we have several advisory committees that also flow out of those HUD funded programs. And so there's also that requirement that remains consistent from our board to our staff to our advisory committees of having the majority of those boards consist of community stakeholders, if you will.
And so for the Hill District, there were two very different processes. The first one, as I said, was grassroots. It was organized by an existing grassroots organization within the Hill District called Hill District Consensus Group. And they're comprised of residents and business owners and nonprofits throughout the Hill District. They're a membership-based organization. And they sit on the board of a community, faith-based, labor and environmental coalition citywide, actually, countywide, called Pittsburgh United. And so, the consensus group had like a ground game within the neighborhood where they organized residents and turned them out to community meetings to select a negotiating team and select, priorities, vote on priorities and things like that. While this larger sort of, community coalition consisting of other stakeholders, provided other support and was part of the negotiating team. And so, there were the labor members of that coalition negotiated things like, wage rates and union neutrality and things like that, right? So it had a grassroots community focus, deciding what's important, what the negotiating terms were for the community, for the neighborhood, but also like a broader coalition negotiating for lots of constituents that were impacted by that development. The CSIP, as I stated, was a coalition of neighborhood-based, or a group of neighborhood-based professionals, real estate developers, community development professionals, workforce development, that were pulled together by the council representative to provide to meet with the developer and public officials to really kind of negotiate terms at a deeper development level, like people who were savvy enough. Anyway, it's a more savvy, more experienced, in development group of folks that was convened by a council representative. And Marimba, who again, unfortunately can't present today, represents Hill CDC, which is the community development corporation in the neighborhood. They're also a registered community organization. Our RCO process is a little bit different. I'm not going to get into that, but what Hill CDC did was they would convene community meetings occasionally to give updates to the extent that they could and get feedback to the extent that they could on terms that they were negotiating in the CSIP. So each had kind of different different processes. And, and both of them achieved, as I said earlier, pretty good results.
Thanks, Bob and Kim. One sort of practice pointer I wanted to make on this topic is that as the attorney, obviously, it's always important to know who your client is. And in some CBA situations, such as the one Kim was talking about, it was clear that our client was Frankfurt CDC. It was clear that Kim, as executive director, was authorized to speak for Frankfurt CDC, and that we, as her counsel, could take her direction as speaking for the client. In CBAs, there can be more complicated situations. There could be a situation where you're approached by multiple organizations. So that can lead to some questions as to who your client is and who you take direction from. We also sometimes have clients who are not incorporated, and they don't actually have an official, like, state recognized structure, and that can be a little complicated in terms of us determining who exactly is going to speak for that group of folks. And so at the beginning of a CBA representation, if we're confronted with any of these sorts of questions, we always try to get a lot of clarity right up front to determine, as the attorney, who our client is and who we can take direction from. So Bob and Kim, you both have sort of answered this question already, so I don't know if we need to spend a lot of time on it, but I guess just as a reminder, it'd be helpful. In your CBA negotiations, what created the leverage to get the developers to come to the table? Because in general, profit-minded developers are not interested in giving something of value away unless they get something in return.
Right. So in our case, again, it was the community approval that they needed for the ZBA process. And again, what that looks like is no zoning, no development project, right? And so in Philadelphia, how that's set up is there are pretty much three entities that sort of get a say, or sort of a weigh in on whether or not a zoning variance should be approved. And that is the community RCO, the city council person's office, and the Philadelphia City Planning Commission usually weighs in. And that's usually done through the district planner for that area. And so, of course, the community organization really holds weight when it comes not just to our own RCO process, but when it comes to communicating with our elected official, who we vote into office and who can be held accountable to the stakeholders that they represent, but also through our local planner, who we work closely with in terms of developing goals to make sure that the neighborhood goals are aligned with the City Planning Commission's goals. So it's very rare that we have a case where the neighborhood is saying, no, this either doesn't fit, or this doesn't work, or this doesn't benefit us, and the city planning, the district planner or the city council person's office is on the total opposite side of the table. Not to say that we never disagree, but we usually work in coordination when it comes to neighborhood plans, knowing what the neighborhood needs are. And if there's a particular project in the neighborhood that is going to impact the neighborhood in a certain way, we're usually really good at being able to communicate with the city council person's office and our district planner to make sure that we're on the same page, or at least we work with the developer to get on the same page. And so, like I said, we not only use our voice as an RCO, but we also advocate to our city council person and our local district planner. So those are the other two avenues that sort of weigh in on that process. And without those supports, again, it's not always the case, but it's going to be very difficult to get ZBA approval for a project if you have all three of those folks who aren't in favor of the project. And so we use that process as a way to leverage getting what the community needs out of a project before we give our approval and our support. And we ask our elected officials and planners to throw their support behind it.
For the arena project, as I said earlier, there was very little leverage over the Pittsburgh Penguins. I mean, the mayor and governor already gave them everything that they needed for that development. There was leverage over public officials, and so what was achieved in that CBA was mostly money from public sources, although the Penguins did commit $1 million toward the development of a grocery store matched with public sources. There wasn't much by way of leverage over the developer in that case. For the Lower Hill development, I mean, that again was a multi-year, multi-phase development that needed public approvals, not only for the development projects themselves, but also for public subsidy, also, for changes to like the development timeline that was originally negotiated, between the Penguins and the entities that own the land, Sports and Exhibition Authority and the Urban Redevelopment Authority. So, I think just to ensure that there would be smooth sailing throughout that multi-phase development process, it was in the interest of the Penguins to work out a community collaboration and implementation plan with community organizations. And so essentially, similar leverage to that which Kim described. Although the community does not have community groups do not have the same power, I think, as those in Philadelphia to just shut down a development that they don't want, to prevent zoning approval. But there were enough moving pieces that where community support would have made it a whole lot easier for the Penguins to have, that it made sense for them to come to the table.
Thanks, Bob and Kim. And so I think like what comes out of what Bob and Kim said, and is true from my experience, is that a CBA negotiation it's really, even though there are lawyers involved, it really is not a legal battle. It's really it's a political battle and a community organizing battle, and it's about power, and it's about leverage. And if the community has a lot of leverage, the community is going to get major concessions, including legal concessions. And if the community doesn't have a lot of leverage, it's not going to get a lot of concessions. And as an attorney, I could make the best legal argument possible for why a term really needs to be in the CBA to protect the community. But I'm not going to win that for my client unless the developer thinks they have to give that in order to get community support, and they need that community support. My next question, and I do want to be mindful of time, we have about 15 minutes left, and I do want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Bob and Kim, could you tell us a little bit about what the process of actually negotiating a CBA looks like? Sort of like, how long does it take? Are these negotiations are they happening in person? Are they happening like by email? Is it how much are the lawyers doing it versus how much is the community involved? Just sort of tell us what that looks like.
Bob, you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, okay. So, in the arena CBA, there was kind of a priority setting exercise used to determine what what community residents wanted to see in the CBA. And there was an agreement among the coalition, the larger coalition, that nobody settles unless everybody settles, right? So, you know, we're not gonna, like, each member of the coalition isn't going to cut their own deal. You know, so they like exerted solidarity among coalition members. As far, and you know, in the second was, I wasn't really privy to how decisions were made, and I wasn't privy to the negotiation process in the CSIP, so I can't really speak to that. I will tell you, in terms of what lawyers can bring to the table, it's, you know, not only, you know, negotiating, like papering an agreement the best that you can, but it's also like bringing our problem solving skills and knowing how, you know, knowing legal requirements, knowing the development process, and you know, if there is an impasse in certain areas, helping to figure out how that impasse can be addressed in a way that advances your client's interests. And sorry to be so vague about that, but I think that that's really more of probably what the legal team brought in the ARENA CBA than actual, you know, I guess legal analysis and we wrote the contract, sure, but it was really more of a problem solving role.
Right. And I think for us, this process started off, it was, this was our first CBA that we negotiated. It was our first CBA, but it wasn't our first negotiation with a private developer. We had actually just went through a joint venture agreement in which Regional Housing Legal Services represented us in that situation. So we weren't totally blind as to how to go into this deal, but when we negotiated the joint venture agreement, which is very similar, but it's more so of an agreement that creates more of a technical partnership between our organization and a private developer versus a community benefits agreement that is really us negotiating for things that benefit the community as a whole. And so I think out of that process, one of the first things I did was I went and talked to other CDCs, and I was just like, how do I even, like, what do I do in this process? What do I ask a developer for in terms of like, what's reasonable? And what do I prioritize? And so I think through that process, we learned about, you know, identifying what needs would benefit the neighborhood in the process, which is where we kind of started. So as a community, we had a phone call where we met with ourselves and without legal counsel and without the developer to sort of determine what those needs were in the neighborhood and what was reasonable to ask of the developer. And so, for example, this was a housing project. I think it's probably 24 units in this project. And, you know, so we're like, these are above market rate units. Most folks who live here can't afford those units. It makes sense for us to negotiate for some of those units to be affordable. And I think we took our key on that really from the city's mixed income housing bonus that they do for zoning. So the city already had a process where they kind of outline a scheme for developers to follow if they want density bonuses. And so in exchange for those density bonuses, the city says, all right, well, you got to make 20% of your units affordable, or you have to pay a certain percentage into our housing trust fund, which guarantees that we fund, you know, affordable housing. And so it was kind of a mixture of what we learned from negotiating our joint venture agreement and sort of what the city had already been doing to encourage affordable housing. And we've kind of applied those things in our conversations by ourselves. I think we took those discussions back to our attorney, back to Regional Housing Legal Services, along with some other things about building preservation and local jobs, and sort of put those out there and sort of got advice from Regional Housing Legal Services as to whether that made sense and if it was reasonable. And then there was a process where we went with our legal counsel back to the private developer to sort of put those things on the table. And I can't remember who sent one first, but from there, we had a term sheet that was developed between us and the private developer that sort of laid out the 5 or 6 things that we wanted out of the community benefits agreement. And then there was a bunch of back and forth as to those things between our legal counsel and the developer's legal counsel. And I think that process took us maybe somewhere north of eight or 9 months. I think we were going back and forth for that. And I think at the time we were in the midst of COVID. And so nothing was done in person. Everything was done through email. I think we had a few virtual meetings, but that was that process. And I don't want to say, I would say, even though the agreement has been signed and formalized, I think implementing it has been another sort of what feels like a negotiation process, which really shouldn't be a negotiating process. And so we are still, to this day, I think we're probably maybe 1.5 years, close to 2 years into actually seeing the CBA implemented.
Thanks, Bob and Kim. Kelly, you can, now would be a good time to do the CLE poll.
Great. This is Kelly. I'm launching the second CLE poll. Attorneys must respond in order to receive credit for your participation, and I will leave this up for 2 minutes. And please feel free to continue. Thank you.
Great. The last question I wanted to pose to Bob and Kim was about something that Kim was starting to get into, which is how to make sure a developer actually does what they say they're going to do. We are short on time, so I'm just going to say a few things about this, and if we have extra time at the end, we can discuss this. This is a tricky issue. I mean, communities in general, they have their most leverage. They have their leverage when they're actually negotiating the CBA, and then in the case of a sort of a zoning variance situation, once they've given support for the project, the developer has a lot less incentive to comply. And so it is very important to be very attuned to this dynamic. One thing that we do generally insist on to help with this is that the agreement be recorded in the property records for the project. And that goes a long way to ensuring that if the project gets sold to a different owner in the future, that owner still has to abide by it, even though they might not have signed the original CBA. And we are also always thinking about ways that the community can be involved in implementation of the project to the extent that they're able, because that can help with the monitoring. So, for example, if the project has an affordable housing component and the community, one thing we've seen in a couple of CBAs recently is that if a community is willing to sort of serve as a referral source for the units, that can help with knowing that people who actually need affordable housing are getting placed in those units because the community has vetted those people themselves and know who they are. But of course, communities don't always have the capacity to do that. Okay, so before we move into the Q&A, I just wanted to share a few resources for those who are interested in learning more. So I have 3 up here, and I can put links to these in the chat. So the first one is the Action Tank CBA toolkit. This is a short ebook, and it's very much community focused and not that legal focused. So I think this is like a good resource for people who are coming at CBAs who want an introduction, but not necessarily from a legal angle. And there's a link to that. The second resource is the Community Benefits Law Center. This is a website that has it has links to a bunch of different articles and publications, as well as CBAs. And the resources on this website are some of them are fairly technical and fairly legal. And so this is, I think, if you're really interested in like diving into the CBA stuff more, especially some of the legal aspects, this is a good resource for it. The last time I was on the website, it didn't look like it had been updated in a little bit. So some things may be a little bit stale. And then finally, there's Regional Housing Legal Services. We have, especially over the past year and a half, we've been negotiating a lot of these. So we're always happy to talk with people about CBAs. And we do have sample CBAs that we can share. So if you're an advocate and you're working on a CBA yourself and you want to talk with us, we'd love to do that. Or if you're out in the community and hear that people are interested in exploring a CBA and need an advocate, we'd welcome those introductions as well. And so in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to see if folks had any questions. And Kelly, do people have the ability to unmute themselves at this point?
Yes, I will push a button and then they'll be able to.
Great. So people can unmute themselves and ask, or we can do questions in the chat.
Okay, people should be good to unmute themselves.
I guess we covered everything in sufficient detail that nobody has any questions.
So in that case, Bob or Kim, do you want to say anything in the last minute that gets to implementation and accountability?
Only that's really tough. You know, like you said, leverage goes away. You know, so to the extent that you can negotiate firm agreements like money, like things that can be easily documented and are one and done, like, okay, it's done, you know, as of the signing of the agreement or easily enforceable, that's good. But, you know, more likely what you're talking about is building a long-term relationship with that developer. And, you know, and that's going to be fluid. And lawyers, I mean, I myself, and I'm uncomfortable with drafting a contract that's very fluid. I have to admit, you know, like it's, I mean, Joe will tell you, like, we're not, you know, like our brains don't work that way, or it's hard for a lawyer's brain to work that way. But that's really kind of, you know, that's one of the factors in CBAs is really developing a long-term, like a working relationship between the community organizations and the developer to work out like post-signing issues.
Yeah, I was just to piggyback off of that. One of the things that's really tough, and so you've heard everything I've said thus far really comes from the city of Philadelphia's strong policy around community engagement and community involvement when it comes to the way a neighborhood is developed. But I think one of our flaws as a city is that like Bob and Joe both said, once you give up that leverage and our developers get that variance, the city no longer enforces community benefits agreement. So that is a legally binding contract. And so as an organization, if you don't have the capacity to hire an attorney, once a developer reneges on that agreement, it's really hard to get some enforcement, because like I said, the city doesn't enforce it. One of the things that we have noted as a tool for the organization, if we're not going to pursue legal action, is really, I think when it comes to zoning attorneys and developers, it's usually not the case that this is like their one and done project in the city of Philadelphia. And so I think letting the city of Philadelphia know who these developers are, that you had a community benefits agreement in place, and what the developer did if they reneged on that agreement, communicating with other RCOs in other neighborhoods, communicating with elected officials and your city planning folks to let folks know is another tool that can be used where, in the case you lack capacity to actually hire an attorney to take it to court. So it's just a tool to keep in the back of your mind. But like Joe and Bob said, implementation can be difficult once you actually have a CBA in place.
Thanks, Kim. So Plan actually needs to use this Zoom account for an event starting right after hours. So we do need to end it here. Thank you very much, Bob and Kim, for your time and sharing your expertise and experience. Thank you, everybody who attended. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions you may have, and Kelly will be distributing the presentation. So thank you, everybody, and Kelly, feel free to stop this Zoom when you want.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yep, you too.